Okay, so welcome everyone to the first installation of our Energy 101 series. We're focusing on current industry today, and those speaking is myself and Trishla. Next slide, please. So let's start off with an overview of energy usage distribution. Next slide. There are generally 5 important types of energy usage that we have represented as sectors. So residential, commercial, industrial, transportation, and electricity. Next slide. So here's a great diagram that links from energy source to energy use that includes wasted energy. As we can see, different sectors consume unique combinations of energy sources. So it's no surprise that petroleum is predominantly used by transportation, specifically cars and airplanes. Coal and nuclear are reserved for electricity generation, but coal is increasingly economically unviable for that. Also, natural gas is used in every sector. Of course, with electricity generation and transportation, there's a lot of rejected energy, which is where emissions and pollution come into play, and we'll see how energy usage ultimately contributes to climate change later on. Next slide. On a global scale, we can see that historically our electricity usage has increased drastically to be on average triple what we used to consume 60 years ago. This is no doubt concerning because we have to meet this increasing demand in an industry that's not really capable of rapid change, especially in infrastructure. Next slide. When we talk about fossil fuels, we typically refer to oil and natural gas. These sources of energy need to be extracted from underground deposits. These deposits are the result of organic matter subjected to countless years of immense pressure. As a result, there are many extraction methods tailored to the type of deposit and the surrounding geologic profile. After a geological survey of a site, a well is constructed to safely extract the oil. For example, with surface casing to protect all water aquifers and avoid contamination. In many cases, a well can be curved to reduce well sites and better configure itself. In the case of fracking, fracking fluid is injected before extraction in order to unlock oil and natural gas in the surrounding rock. Next slide, please. When we talk about proved reserves, this means specifically that they can be recovered under existing economic and operating conditions with reasonable certainty, not just that we can prove its existence. Unproved reserves are, for lack of a better word, a guesstimate, if where potentially proved reserves could be. It's no surprise that proved oil reserves are the whole basis of our global economy. They can be a big part of a company's assets, what the stock price is based on, but because of that, the price of oil goes up and down based on economic conditions. In terms of reserve trends, coal reserves have gone down while oil and gas have gone way up due to better extraction and surveying technology. The global distribution of fossil fuel reserves has Venezuela and Ecuador with a lot of oil, North America and Australia with primarily coal, the Middle East with oil and natural gas, and not that much exploration in Africa. Next slide, please. In Energy 101 Part 2, we'll continue more on fossil fuels and introduce renewable energy properly. But as a quick intro, about 10% of primary energy consumption comes from renewable energy. But as we saw from the pipeline graph, it mostly goes into electricity generation. Also, the rejected energy produced from renewables is significantly less than fossil fuels. As for the current state of fossil fuels, in 2018, the United States produced more oil than Saudi Arabia, since Obama reversed a ban instituted by Reagan against crude oil to lower imports. Additionally, Europe tends to have much higher gas prices to mandate lower consumption of fuel. Next slide, please. So safety. Safety of employees who extract and refine energy has improved through regulation, which is usually spurred by major accidents. The main safety concerns we're referring to are construction accidents, radiation exposure, explosions and fires, and operating accidents. Many well-known tragedies included here are Hoover Dam, Chernobyl, Fukushima, and Deepwater Horizon. Next slide, please.
Okay, I'll be covering this section, which will be on the electric grid. Next slide, please. So America has 3 grids, one for the West that includes a tiny bit of Mexico and much of Western Canada, one for the East, and one separate ones like just for Texas. Next slide. And one thing we can see is that the grid is actually very outdated. More than 70% of the grid's transmission lines and transformers are 25 years old. And we rely on twice as many power plants as we actually need because of the massive inefficiencies built into the system. And actually, America has the highest number of outage minutes of any developed nation in the world. And this is actually really costly for our GDP because we see a visible dip in our economy whenever there's a power outage. Next slide. So now we'll move on to actually how the grid in America works. There are individual generators and a variety of facilities generate electricity. So this could be coal, natural gas, and they're burning power plants, nuclear power plants, hydroelectric dams, wind turbines, and solar panels. And the location of these facilities from end users vary depending on how they are actually generating electricity. Each technology is manipulated differently on the power grid because of fundamental differences between these different facilities that are generating electricity. But there's always a reserve margin, and which is a specified amount of backup electricity generated capacity that is available to compensate for potential forecasting errors or unexpected power plant shutdowns. Next slide. So the first step in, I guess, like the grid is the generator. And the generator can only be built with approval from the PUC, which is the Public Utility Commission, or the PSC, which is the Public Service Commission. And these agencies set appropriate electricity rates within their state that the utilities must abide by. Next slide. And then we have transmission lines. The transmission lines are necessary to carry high voltage electricity over long distances and connect electricity generators and electricity consumers. These are either overhead power lines or underground power cables. And underground power cables are usually less expensive. And then the distribution network is the last stage, and this is simply the system of wires that picks up where the transmission lines leave off. These networks start at the transformers and end with houses, schools, and businesses. Distribution is related to the PUCs and the PSCs, and they retail for electricity in each state. And then the last final stage of the electricity grid is the consumers, which set the load for how much electricity they, I guess, like need. So just like looking back, there are a few strengths and weaknesses with this grid that's been created. First, electricity grid is pretty reliable. Since the grid is an enormous network, electricity can be deployed to the right places across large regions of the country. Second is flexibility. The electricity grid allows the power system to use a diversity of resources, even if they are located far away from where the power is needed. For example, wind turbines must be built where the wind is strongest, and the grid allows for electricity to be transmitted to distant cities. And then we also have economic competition. Because the grid allows for multiple generators and power plants, this provides electricity to consumers, and different generators have to compete with each other to provide electricity at the cheapest price. The grid also serves as a form of insurance because the competition on the grid protects customers against fluctuations in fuel prices. But there still needs to be improvements made to the grid. Energy storage technologies could allow electricity to be stored for use when demand for electricity peaks or increases rapidly, which would increase in efficiency and reliability. And distributed generation systems, such as solar panels or individual homes, could reduce the distance that electricity has to travel, and that could increase efficiency and save lots of money. Yeah, so that's a wrap up on, next slide. So yeah, I kind of covered some of this, but for more information about the competition in the grid, so actually the grid was deregulated post the energy crisis in the 70s, and this allowed for more wholesale competition. So 17 states allow customers to actually buy electricity from competitive retail suppliers, but other states are more vertically structured still. Next slide. So now we're going to be discussing, actually this is Angela's part. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so next we'll discuss the energy industry's impact on our environment. Next slide, please. So thinking back to the pipeline diagram, all that rejected energy has to go somewhere. And in most cases, it's released as greenhouse gases and other pollutants into the environment. As we increase our production to meet exponentially increasing demand, the production of pollution increases accordingly. As you can see from this graph, there's a high correlation between global temperature increase and CO2 increase. So this suggests a directly proportional relationship between the two parameters. Next slide, please. On a global scale, our emissions are increasing exponentially and consistently country by country. In terms of global distribution, we can see that developing countries are particularly susceptible to emissions due to reliance on fossil fuels and low efficiency energy production technology. We can see that developing countries are affected disproportionately by climate change because of this. And many NGOs that hope to ameliorate this problem construct renewable energy projects and introduce higher efficiency technology to developing countries. In general, this drastic increase in emissions stems from the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Next slide, please. So what is the relationship between carbon dioxide and global temperature? When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we primarily look at CO2. For reference, in the US, carbon dioxide accounts for 81.3% of emissions, but there are also others such as nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, which cause a lot of respiratory problems. So the greenhouse gas effect is a natural process which is responsible for our livable temperature range, breathable air, and non-boiling ocean water. It's the appropriate distribution of solar radiation, which is the origin of all forms of energy. Solar radiation is emitted from the sun through the greenhouse gas layer and into our atmosphere. And along the way, it's reflected by many types of surfaces, such as clouds, ocean surface, and land, until it's ultimately absorbed by the ground. The reflected heat is then sent back up through the atmosphere as re-radiated heat until it encounters the greenhouse gas layer again, and most of that heat escapes into space, while a smaller portion is trapped and retained by our environment. The problem with human-enhanced greenhouse gas effect is that the proportion of re-radiated heat that's released into space versus retained is flipped. Increased concentration of greenhouse gases makes it harder for heat to escape into space. Instead, even more re-radiated heat is retained, causing higher temperatures. We can see evidence of climate change in ice melting, in addition to sea ice extent and spring snow cover reducing. Next slide, please. So the crux of the issue is sustainability, which is a highly politicized issue. But when we as energy professionals talk about sustainability, we're actually referring to continuous and efficient harnessing of energy sources. This means that we focus on extracting and consuming our energy resources so that they're not substantially depleted, but capable of continued use so that future generations can meet their own energy needs. This issue is definitely complicated by large unmet energy demand in developing countries, uneven distribution of oil, and energy options constrained by legislation due to economics. However, the issue of climate change makes it glaringly obvious that we aren't using our energy resources in a sustainable and efficient way. Therefore, we need to take innovative steps so that we can prevent further perpetuation of substantial health hazards and social injustices. As we can see, improvements on energy efficiency provides a lot of benefits socially, economically, and environmentally. Efficiency improvement will reduce energy demand. On the supply side, electricity generation utilizes combined heat and power and combined gas turbines to reduce rejected energy. On the demand side, residential and commercial sectors use building insulation and energy efficient windows, while the industrial sector takes advantage of reduced heat processes and energy efficient motors. In the transportation sector, there are benefits from efficient road vehicles and a move more towards public transportation. With these energy efficient examples, less energy is needed to power our surroundings and thus less emissions. Next slide, please. Renewables are certainly attractive in providing sustainable emissionless energy production, but they're not the only way to combat climate change. Many countries are also looking into carbon capture technology, which is designed to specifically prevent the release of CO2 into our atmosphere from the fossil fuel industry. The CO2 produced from fossil fuel power plants is captured instead of released into the environment and converted into liquid. As a liquid, CO2 is transported by a combination of pipeline, truck, and ship to injection wells for deep underground storage under the seabed. This stored CO2 could be reused to target unminable coal seams and depleted oil and gas reservoirs by injecting the CO2 to release methane and recover potential oil and natural gas. Next slide, please.
Okay, so now we're going to be discussing a really exciting case study of electric vehicles in the energy industry. Next slide. So the electric vehicle industry has a lot of potential. An electric vehicle converts over 50% of the electrical energy from the grid to power at the wheels, whereas gas-powered vehicles only manage to convert about 17 to 21% of the energy stored in gasoline. So this is a huge improvement from using like our typical internal combustion like engine cars. So there are favorable government policies and support in terms of subsidies and grants, tax rebates, and other non-financial benefits in the form of carpool lane access, new car registration, and increasing vehicle range, better availability of charging infrastructure, and proactive participation by different automotive like OEMs that could drive the global electric vehicle sales. And we definitely do see a big push towards EVs in the next 10 years, but there are a lot of different factors we have to consider in actually how the industry is going to be moving forward. Next slide. So actually most consumers right now are very reluctant to commit to buying electric vehicles because of both infrastructure and doubts about the technology. Developed nations such as the US, Germany, and the UK are actively promoting the use of electric vehicles to reduce emissions, which has resulted in the growth of electric vehicle sales. And finally, China has the highest sales of EVs in the world right now. Next slide. There's huge steps forward being made by manufacturers in terms of battery power and system efficiency, both of which contribute significantly to the usability of EVs in particular. Battery aging, which is the gradual breakdown of a battery using successive charges, is a real issue, and many manufacturers are working on alternatives to wet type batteries, but EVs will remain sold in smaller numbers until this issue is resolved at least. The purchase price is also a significant issue, and governments must put pressure on manufacturers to reduce price, which makes these vehicles appeal to a greater market. As we can see, the electric car has a huge impact in terms of sustainability and the environment, but there are still many different factors that are limiting the use of electric cars. Next slide, please. Yeah, so like I mentioned before, battery aging is an issue, and another huge issue is the spotty charging infrastructure, which is a huge hampering for a lot of individuals to actually buy these electric vehicles, just because they don't know if there's enough charging ports for them to drive like long distances. And again, their range is also limited for an electric vehicle. And until these cars are actually cheaper than the normal internal combustion engine car, we won't see these cars be adopted until it actually is a lower price than these our traditional car. Next slide.
I have a little technical difficulties here. Yeah.
Oh, I think actually that's the last slide.
Oh, okay.
I didn't realize. But yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Let us know if you have any questions or want to discuss anything further.
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask some questions, guys. Seriously, we're all ears.
Hi, Sean here. Quick question about the lithium ions because I know that's the battery and the storage is a huge problem with the electric cars. How do you think the energy industry and particularly electric cars are going to um, kind of innovate on that going forward? If you have any ideas.
Um, yeah, I actually am not too knowledgeable about the subject. All I know is that like right now, like lithium ion batteries don't provide the efficiency that's needed or like enough storage capacity. So that's why it's hampering the electric vehicle market. So there's like a lot of work underway right now to be able to like develop these batteries further to be able to be used such that it's not a barrier to the market.
I'd like to elaborate on that additionally, in that when we think about battery storage for EVs, we also have to think about the availability of EV charging stations. Because I know of one case study in Oslo, Norway, is that in addition to like the batteries continuously like freezing up due to the Nordic climate, there's also a huge issue with being able to take your car out into like I guess the forests in Norway and being away from the capital, Oslo, where most of the EV charging stations are centered around. So when we think about being able to have that large storage, we also have to think about, are there enough EV charging stations around? So it's that kind of push and pull relationship.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Any other questions? For all yours.
Yeah, I have a quick question about like considering the effects of like manufacturing an electric vehicle. For example, like the emissions that are associated with like mining rare earth minerals and metals to like for the batteries, and just like generally pollution from the manufacturing process that like occurs in when creating EVs. So like how do we balance that that effect on emissions with the potential impact of electric vehicles with like compared to like oil vehicles or like general gas powered vehicles? Like there's definitely something to be said there. So I was wondering if you guys considered that and like what the effect is of that.
So I didn't actually know about this. Angela, do you have anything to say about it?
I do think that typically when you're replacing technology with higher efficiency, that you have to look for a certain time range. So when we think about replacing like fully functional diesel powered cars, we have to look at typically it's a 40-year range that they look at, like, oh, is the accumulated emissions from using a diesel car, is that comparable to the initial manufacturing of the EVs, but over a long time, like since it's a little bit, since it's like definitely less emissions, then how do we compare the total ones? I do agree too that there's a fairly serious issue with the EV industry in that when you're powering cars from the electric grid, those are from, like, depending on which electric grid you're getting your supply from, those could have come from energy sources that required emissions as well. So that's another consideration to take into account, because I'm going to keep going back to Norway because that's most of my EV knowledge. But in Norway, there's also, they're able to claim that their cars and the usage is emissionless because their electric grid is powered by hydropower and through geothermal sources. So that the Norway hydropower technology is truly emissionless. And so you can say that driving my car is also emissionless. But if you're not taking into account the emissions from the electric grid that you're supplying your car from, then that's very problematic because you're not taking into account the full scope. Hopefully that answers some portion of your question. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
While we're on the subject of the electric grid, I remember someone put in the PowerPoint a statistic that the vast majority of the power grid in the United States is outdated. I'm just wondering why that is and what the implications of that are.
Yeah, so I can answer that question. As to why it is, I think it's because it's really expensive to be able to replace a lot of the infrastructure that's already put in place. And as to the implications, like there are a lot of implications. For instance, like it's like very like the grid is very inefficient, and we rely on twice as many power plants as we actually need because of the massive inefficiencies built into the system. And another implication is that we have the highest number of outage minutes of any developed nation, and that means that it's actually really costly to our GDP if we have outage minutes because we can actually see the GDP drop whenever there is an outage in the US. So economically, it's like a huge disadvantage if we have an inefficient electricity grid. And I guess the reason why it hasn't been replaced yet is because of the fact that it's a very expensive and like very complicated system to replace.
I can also speak to that on a professional perspective in that a lot of the, there's a lot of energy loss. Additionally, when you steep up and steep down the current as you're going through the transmission and distribution process. Additionally, with the outage minutes, it's very difficult to be able to detect faults, which are when like a power line goes down and there's nothing to like replace the energy supply. And really this like the sensor technology in order to be able to detect those faults is extremely lacking and again very expensive from like a professional standpoint.
I have a question about that. How does the grid like compare in other countries, like in Europe? Like, is it structured differently and is it more efficient?
So I'm not too knowledgeable about the grid in other countries, but I do know that actually like our system is much more outdated than other systems, and we have like more outage minutes than other countries. Like other countries, like we have 6 hours of outage minutes per like outage hours, I guess, per year. And then other countries, for instance, like Italy has top 51 minutes, Germany has 15 minutes, and Japan has 11 minutes. So we can just like see the scale of how inefficient our system is just by how many outage minutes there are. Angela, do you have anything to add to that?
I will say too that they're like, especially in Europe, it's much more dynamic, the incorporation of renewable energy as well. Whereas to like serve as more of like a backup. Whereas, yeah, it's very difficult just given like the geological span of each of these like the distribution networks in the US, and that it's not very like capable, it's capable of serving such a large community, but not as efficiently. Because I feel like with Europe, there's much smaller, more concentrated grids, and that outage prevention is much higher because of that small geological span. But that's as much as my knowledge goes.
Is there any way that, where do you think the majority of the, I'd like to say, innovation or talent or human capital in the energy field is going? I know that you did a very broad overview of all the things that are going on, but where do you think it's growing and most people find themselves working?
I think what's really like up and coming is definitely EVs, but more specifically autonomous electric vehicles and being able to like control how like how we can like better deliver any type of good without humans in it. Additionally, I think energy storage is definitely up and coming, and renewable energy integration for sure. I will say though, if you're looking towards the fossil fuel industry, they're much more they're much more targeted at being energy efficient in the resources that they have, and new extraction models for sure. Fracking comes to mind.
I'm curious about like the like ability also of like other clean, I guess, sources like nuclear, for example, and how like we as a society like said, okay, that's like not clean, and like we're going to stay away from that generation method. But like, is there a lot of like development in making maybe like something like nuclear more efficient, or like have less of an impact on the environment? And is that something that could like also be worked on in tandem with like renewable sources like solar and wind?
I think in my experience, nuclear has been kind of been deactivated, at least in the utilities sphere. Like they're looking to retire a lot of nuclear power plants. I'm not too sure about the nuclear industry in general, but that's my perspective from a utilities standpoint. Just because they don't want that kind of, responsibility, I guess.
Yeah, I can actually add a little bit more on that. So there's a lot of older technologies that people are trying to move away from, and there's recently been a resurgence in a lot of energy startups focused on nuclear energy. Most of them are based in Europe, and they're generally focusing on developing nations more because there's less of a stigma against nuclear energy in those regions.
Cool, thanks.
I think we're going to call that for our Q&A. And it seems also like a lot of you guys are really interested in electric vehicles and the energy industry as a whole. So I'm happy to tell you guys that this Friday, we're going to be having a tech careers panel, October 23rd, 5 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to have people from companies like Tesla, Valero, Chevron, a lot of different places giving a lot of great advice. So we've already shared it on our Facebook, but please feel free to RSVP to it. It's been dropped in the chat, and also sign up like our Facebook page and just keep tabs on it, because it's going to give you a lot of really great career tips, career information, and just a lot of ideas about your future prospects.
Also, we'd like to plug our part 2, which is renewables and alternatives, on October 26th, and part 3, which is energy related fields such as like finance and consulting, in November.